Daniel Carter never considered himself the type to get involved in neighborhood drama. He was too busy for that kind of nonsense. His job as a respiratory therapist at a busy hospital was demanding, with exhausting 12-hour shifts that often stretched into 14. By the time he clocked out and made the 30-minute drive home, all he wanted was to pull into his driveway, drag himself inside, and collapse into bed. His home was his sanctuary, the one place where he could shut out the chaos of the hospital and recharge. The driveway was a crucial part of this sanctuary. It wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. The street parking in his neighborhood was a disaster. Finding a legal spot sometimes felt like winning the lottery, and the city was notorious for handing out parking tickets for the smallest infractions. He and his wife, Emily, had specifically chosen their modest one-story house because it had a private driveway big enough for 2 cars. That meant no endless circling around the block, no waking up to find their car towed for some obscure parking violation, and no dealing with random people blocking their way. Emily worked a normal 9-to-5 job, so she was usually home by the time the worst of the evening parking battle started. She appreciated the driveway just as much as he did. But it wasn't just about convenience. Daniel's elderly father, George, visited frequently. Ever since a bad fall the previous year, George had struggled with mobility. He could still get around, but walking too far, especially over uneven sidewalks, was difficult for him. Having the driveway meant he could park close to the house and avoid unnecessary strain. For a long time, things were peaceful. Daniel would return home in the early morning, park in his driveway, and slip inside for some much-needed sleep. Emily would leave for work without any hassle, and George would come and go as needed without difficulty. There were no issues, no unexpected problems, just the simple, predictable rhythm of everyday life. Then, one morning, everything changed. It had been a brutal shift. The ICU was overloaded, they were short-staffed, and Daniel had spent most of the night rushing between patients, barely getting a moment to breathe. The only thing that had kept him going was the thought of finally sinking into his couch, microwaving some leftover lasagna, and passing out for a few hours. But as he turned onto his street, he noticed something strange. A car, a beige sedan, was parked in his driveway. For a moment, his exhausted brain refused to process what he was seeing. Maybe he had turned onto the wrong street? But no, there was his house, his front door, his windows. And in his driveway, blocking his way, was someone else's car. His first reaction wasn't even anger, just pure confusion. Maybe it was a mistake. A neighbor's visitor who had parked in the wrong driveway. Someone who had misread an address and thought they were at a friend's house. Mistakes happened, right? No need to overreact. He pulled up behind the car but remained on the street, scribbled a polite note, and tucked it under the windshield wiper. It was simple. "Hi, this is my private driveway. Please don't park here. Thanks." He figured that would be enough. Most people, once they realized their mistake, would apologize and never do it again. That day, he parked on the street, which was a minor inconvenience but nothing catastrophic. He told himself it was a one-time thing. Just a misunderstanding. The next morning, after another long shift, he turned onto his street and immediately felt his blood pressure spike. The beige sedan was still there. Not only that, but his note, the polite request he had left, was now crumpled up and tossed into the bushes near his walkway. That was when Daniel realized this wasn't just a mistake. Someone had seen his note, read it, and deliberately ignored it. Not only that, they had made a point to disrespect him by throwing his request into the bushes like it was garbage. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Losing his temper wasn't going to help. Maybe whoever this was still didn't understand. Maybe they needed a firmer message. So he wrote another note, this one less friendly than the first. Private driveway. Do not park here. Final warning. He even underlined the words private driveway in bold Sharpie, just to make sure the point was crystal clear. Once again, he parked on the street and trudged inside, exhausted and frustrated. He told himself this would be the last time he gave them the benefit of the doubt. 2 warnings were enough. If they parked there again, he would have to take action. But deep down, he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. After 2 days of coming home to find a stranger's car in his driveway, Daniel was done being polite. He had left 1 friendly note and 1 firm warning. That was more than enough. If the car was there again, he was going to find out exactly who was responsible. Sure enough, when he turned onto his street after another exhausting shift, the beige sedan was sitting in his driveway like it had every right to be there. Daniel's jaw tightened. But this time he had a plan. He wasn't going to leave another note. He was going to wait. He parked on the street and leaned against the hood of his car, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the sedan. The exhaustion from his shift faded, replaced by sheer frustration. He didn't have to wait long. After about 5 minutes, the front door of the house across the street swung open, and out stepped an older woman in oversized sunglasses and a floral blouse. She walked toward his driveway like she owned the place, fishing in her bag for her car keys. Daniel stood up straight and took a deep breath. This was it. "Excuse me," he called, stepping forward. "Is this your car?" The woman, who looked to be in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, paused and finally glanced at him. "Yes, why?" she said, her tone completely devoid of concern. She didn't even sound guilty. Just mildly irritated, like he had asked her an unnecessary question. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. "This is my driveway," he said evenly. "I've left notes asking you not to park here. You can't just leave your car on someone else's property." Instead of apologizing, the woman let out a dramatic sigh and gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "Oh, come on. Street parking around here is terrible. I'm only here during the day. You're not even home. What's the big deal?" Daniel blinked, caught between disbelief and anger. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was entitlement in its purest form. She knew it was his driveway. She knew he didn't want her parking there. And she just didn't care. "It's a big deal because it's my property," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I work nights. I come home exhausted. I need my driveway." The woman, who he would later learn was named Margaret Thompson, rolled her eyes like he was a child throwing a tantrum. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're gone all night. It's just sitting empty. Why should I have to struggle with street parking when you're not even using it?" Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just entitlement, it was complete disregard for basic decency. He had met some entitled people before, but this was another level. She genuinely believed that because he wasn't home at night, she had the right to use his driveway during the day. He took a slow breath, clenching his fists to keep himself from saying something he'd regret. "That's not how property works," he said firmly. "You don't get to use something just because it's empty. If you park here again, I'm going to have your car towed." Margaret let out an exaggerated groan, as if he was the one being unreasonable. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, finally unlocking her car. "Fine, whatever." She climbed in and started the engine, but before pulling out, she turned to look at him through the window. "You know, you're being really selfish." Daniel actually laughed. He couldn't help it. Selfish? She was parking in his driveway, and he was the selfish one? That was some next-level mental gymnastics. Without another word, Margaret backed out of his driveway and drove off, peeling away just a little too aggressively for someone her age. Daniel watched her go, shaking his head. He had a feeling this wasn't over. For the next couple of days, things were quiet. Daniel came home to find his driveway blissfully empty, and Emily joked that maybe the driveway battle had been won. Maybe Margaret had finally gotten the message. That sense of relief didn't last long. One morning, Daniel pulled into his street and felt his stomach drop. Not only was Margaret's beige sedan parked in his driveway again, but there was another car there too. A second vehicle, completely blocking the driveway, as if his property had become a designated parking lot. His hands gripped the steering wheel. This was no longer just entitlement. This was a deliberate power move. She was testing him, seeing how far she could push before he snapped. Daniel parked on the street and walked up to his front door, where Emily was waiting. She had the day off and was supposed to be heading out for an appointment, but Margaret's car was blocking the garage. "I tried honking," Emily said, arms crossed. No one came out. Daniel took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. That was it. No more warnings. No more polite conversations. Margaret had made her choice. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and called the tow company. 20 minutes later, the first tow truck arrived, and within moments, the driver had Margaret's car hooked up and ready to go. The second tow truck followed shortly after, and took the other mystery vehicle. It was almost too easy. As Daniel stood on his porch, watching the cars disappear down the street, he felt a wave of satisfaction. For the first time in days, he had control back. Later that afternoon, the storm arrived. Daniel had just sat down with a cup of coffee when he heard it, an ear-splitting scream from outside. He set down his mug and walked to the front window, peering out through the curtains. Margaret was standing in his driveway, arms flailing, eyes wide with fury. It was the exact kind of reaction he had expected. Without hesitation, he opened the door and stepped outside. Margaret whirled around at the sound of the door, her face twisted with rage. "Where is my car?" she shrieked. Daniel took a sip of his coffee, deliberately unbothered. "Toad." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't do that." "I can," Daniel said coolly. "It's private property. You ignored my warnings. Now you can pick it up at the impound lot." Margaret's face turned bright red. "You had no right." "I had every right," Daniel interrupted. "And if you park here again, it'll happen again." Margaret looked like she was about to explode. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, her whole body shaking. Then suddenly she changed tactics. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice turned dramatically wounded. "This is harassment," she said, shaking her head in fake disbelief. "You're targeting me. I'm calling the police." Daniel almost laughed. She was the one trespassing, and now she was trying to play the victim? "Go ahead," he said, gesturing toward her house. "Call them. I'll be happy to show them the security footage." For a split second, Margaret hesitated. Then, to Daniel's complete and utter amusement, she actually pulled out her phone and dialed 911 right in front of him. Daniel crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, waiting. He couldn't wait to see how this played out. Margaret had called 911. That much was certain. Whether she genuinely believed she was the victim or was simply hoping to cause trouble, Daniel couldn't say. But one thing was clear. This was about to get even more ridiculous. He leaned against his doorframe, watching her as she dramatically paced in his driveway, phone pressed to her ear. From his porch, he could hear snippets of her exaggerated complaint. "Yes, officer, I am being harassed. My car was stolen, well towed, but without cause. This man is bullying me. No, I don't know why. He's just being cruel." Daniel sighed. He had spent years dealing with patients in high-stress environments, calming down anxious people in the ER. He knew the tone of a manufactured crisis when he heard one. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled onto the street. 2 officers stepped out, both looking like they had already dealt with way too much nonsense that day. The taller officer, who looked to be in his mid-40s, approached first. Margaret immediately launched into her tirade. "This man," she began, jabbing a finger at Daniel, "had my car towed for no reason. He's been watching me, harassing me, making my life miserable. I am a senior citizen, and I don't feel safe in my own neighborhood anymore." Daniel waited patiently, arms crossed, until she finally paused for breath. The second officer, a younger guy in his early 30s, turned to Daniel with a neutral expression. "Sir, can you tell us your side of the story?" Daniel nodded. "Absolutely." He motioned toward the driveway. "This is my private property. This woman has been parking here without permission for over a week. I've left multiple warnings, both written and verbal. She ignored them, so I had her car towed." The officers glanced at each other. The older cop turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, is this his driveway?" Margaret folded her arms and huffed. "That's not the point." The younger cop pulled out a notepad. "It actually is the point." Margaret threw up her hands. "It's just sitting empty all day. What's the harm? Why should I have to struggle with street parking when he's not even using it half the time?" The officers didn't even try to hide their exasperation. "That's not how property works, ma'am," the older cop said. Daniel, to his credit, remained calm. "I also have security footage," he added, motioning toward the small camera mounted above his garage. "It shows her repeatedly trespassing and ignoring my warnings. If needed, I'm happy to provide that." The moment the word footage was mentioned, Margaret stiffened. She knew she had lost. Still, she tried one last desperate defense. "This is ridiculous. The whole neighborhood agrees with me," she declared. "Everyone thinks he should share his driveway." The younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Did you take a neighborhood vote on that?" Margaret's mouth opened, then snapped shut. She let out an exasperated scoff. The older officer rubbed his temples. "Ma'am, you were trespassing on private property. This gentleman was well within his rights to have your vehicle towed. If you continue to park here, you could be facing legal consequences. Do you understand?" Margaret's face turned red, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, she looked like she might argue. But then, clearly realizing she wasn't going to win this round, she gave an aggressive nod. "Fine," she muttered. "Whatever." The officers, satisfied that the situation had been handled, gave Daniel a small nod and returned to their cruiser. Margaret, meanwhile, stomped across the street to her house, muttering to herself the entire way. Daniel exhaled, relieved. Maybe, just maybe, this was finally over. He should have known better. A few days later, when he got home from a shift, he found a letter taped to his front door. The handwriting was overly dramatic cursive, the kind that looked like it belonged on a Victorian-era love letter. But the contents were anything but romantic. It was a fake petition. The letter claimed to represent the entire neighborhood and stated that Daniel's refusal to share his driveway was causing unnecessary conflict. It insisted that he should open his heart and allow the community to benefit from the unused space. Daniel burst out laughing. First of all, the letter was obviously from Margaret. He recognized the same passive-aggressive tone she had used before. Second, he had already spoken to his neighbors, and none of them had an issue with his driveway. Just to be thorough, he checked in with a few of them. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived next door, laughed when he showed her the letter. "Oh, I didn't sign this nonsense," she said, shaking her head. "That woman has always been a menace." Another neighbor, Mark, a middle-aged father of two, was equally baffled. "What kind of logic is that? If someone's house is empty during the day, do I get to hang out in their living room? That's insane." With the community petition thoroughly debunked, Daniel tucked the letter away for future reference. He had a strong feeling he might need it. Then, just when he thought things couldn't get more ridiculous, Margaret upped the ante. Emily came home from work one evening, laughing so hard she could barely talk. When she finally calmed down enough to explain, Daniel couldn't believe it. Margaret had placed 2 bright orange construction cones at the entrance of their driveway. And next to the cones, a handwritten sign that read, "Community use free parking." Daniel stood on his porch, staring at the absurd setup. He didn't know whether to be angry or impressed by the sheer audacity. Without a word, he grabbed the cones and moved them onto Margaret's lawn. Then he called the non-emergency police line to document the incident, just in case. As he walked back into the house, he caught movement from across the street. Margaret was peeking from behind her curtains, watching like some sort of villain from a low-budget soap opera. He gave her a small wave. She immediately vanished behind the curtains. At this point, Daniel figured Margaret would eventually tire herself out. But she wasn't just entitled, she was determined. And a few nights later, she made one final mistake. Daniel had just returned home from work, exhausted but looking forward to finally parking in his own driveway without incident. He turned the corner, saw his house, and his stomach dropped. Margaret's beige sedan was back. At midnight, she had deliberately waited for him to lower his guard, thinking she could sneak in without being noticed. She miscalculated. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pulled into a legal street spot, took out his phone, and immediately called the tow company. He had already spoken to them after the last incident, and they assured him that if she ever parked there again, they would come right away. No waiting. No delays. 30 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. The driver, whom Daniel now recognized, gave him a knowing smirk as he hooked up Margaret's car. Daniel stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as justice was served once again. As the tow truck pulled away into the night, he felt no guilt. Margaret had been warned. Margaret had ignored the warnings. And Margaret had just lost the battle for good. The next morning, Daniel had barely settled in with his coffee when it happened. A blood-curdling shriek erupted from across the street, loud enough to wake the dead. Margaret had discovered that her car was gone. Daniel calmly took a sip of his coffee, watching from the window as she stormed out of her house, eyes wide with panic. She spun in circles, scanning the street, looking for some divine intervention to explain where her precious sedan had disappeared to. Then she turned. She spotted Daniel standing in his driveway, completely unbothered, and her expression morphed from panic to fury in less than a second. She stomped toward his house with the determination of someone marching into battle. Before she even reached the porch, she was already yelling, "Where is my car?" Daniel, still perfectly calm, took another sip of coffee and motioned toward the sign near his garage. Probably at the impound lot. Margaret's jaw dropped. She looked like she was on the verge of spontaneously combusting. "You had me towed again?" she shrieked. "Are you insane?" Daniel shrugged. "Are you?" Margaret's face went scarlet. She pointed an accusing finger at him, her voice trembling with rage. "This is harassment. I'm calling the police." Daniel let out a slow sigh, already bored of this conversation. "Go ahead. They already told you last time that you're trespassing. Let's see what they have to say this time." For a moment, Margaret hesitated. But in true entitled lunatic fashion, She yanked out her phone and actually dialed 911. Again. It was like déjà vu. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up. This time, only one officer stepped out, the younger cop from last time. The moment he saw who was involved, he visibly sighed. "Ma'am," he said, rubbing his temples as he approached, "we've been through this." Margaret wasn't having it. "He had my car stolen." Again. The officer turned to Daniel, who simply gestured to the security camera. "She was trespassing." Again. "I called a tow truck." Again. The officer closed his eyes for a second, inhaling deeply as though he was mentally counting to 10. Then he turned back to Margaret. "Ma'am, we told you last time, this is private property. He is legally allowed to tow any vehicle that parks here without permission." Margaret's mouth opened, then snapped shut. She wasn't expecting that. "So that's it," she sputtered. "He can just tow people whenever he feels like it." The officer gave her a flat look. "Yes, because it's his property." Margaret gasped like she had just been slapped in the face with reality. "But it's not fair," she wailed. "Street parking is a nightmare. He's barely even here during the day. The neighborhood agrees that this is unreasonable." Daniel snorted. "Oh, here we go again." The officer eyed her warily. "The neighborhood agrees?" Margaret smirked as if she had just played her trump card. "Yes. In fact, I have a petition." Daniel had to physically stop himself from laughing. Margaret marched back to her house and returned with a crumpled piece of paper. It was the same dramatic cursive letter Daniel had found taped to his door a few days ago. The officer took the paper, scanned it for a few seconds, and sighed. "There are no signatures on this," he said. Margaret looked like she had been punched in the gut. "That's because everyone was too scared to sign." The officer handed the letter back to her without a word. Daniel, still trying to keep a straight face, decided to twist the knife just a little. "Oh, actually, I asked the neighbors about it. Turns out, no one agreed with you." Margaret's eye twitched. The officer closed his notepad, clearly done with this circus. "Ma'am, if you park in this driveway again, you could be charged with trespassing. Consider this your final warning." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned, stomped back across the street, and slammed her door so hard that a nearby squirrel fell out of a tree. Daniel figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. 2 days later, Emily came home howling with laughter. "You're not going to believe this," she gasped, barely able to breathe. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Do I want to?" Emily pulled out her phone and showed him a picture. Margaret had placed 2 bright orange construction cones at the entrance of their driveway. Next to the cones was a handwritten sign that read, "Community use free parking." Daniel stared at the photo for a long moment. Then, without a word, he grabbed his keys, walked outside, and moved the cones onto Margaret's lawn. Then, he calmly walked back into the house, sat down, and pulled out his phone. "Who are you calling?" Emily asked, still giggling. "The non-emergency police line," he replied. Emily burst out laughing all over again. A few minutes later, as Daniel stood by the window, he caught movement from across the street. Margaret was peeking through her curtains. The moment she saw him looking, she vanished like a cartoon villain retreating into the shadows. Daniel exhaled. This woman was relentless. That night, after another long shift, he turned onto his street, praying for peace. But the moment his headlights hit his house, his stomach sank. Margaret's beige sedan was back. At midnight, she had deliberately waited for him to lower his guard. But she hadn't counted on one thing. Daniel was prepared. Without hesitation, he pulled into a legal street spot, pulled out his phone, and dialed the number he now had memorized. The tow company picked up immediately. "She did it again?" the dispatcher asked, almost amused. "She did it again. Sending a truck now." 30 minutes later, the familiar tow truck rolled onto the street. The driver, whom Daniel now recognized, stepped out with a knowing grin. "Her again." Daniel nodded. "Her again." The driver chuckled as he hooked up Margaret's car. Daniel stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching as the tow truck pulled away into the night. And this time, he knew it was over for good. The next morning, Daniel woke up feeling refreshed for the first time in days. There was no tension, no irritation, just the simple joy of knowing that Margaret had lost. Or so he thought. As he brewed his morning coffee, he heard something heavy slam against his front door. A second later, there was a rapid, angry pounding, the kind that made it sound like someone was trying to break the door down. Daniel sighed. "Here we go." He set his mug down, walked to the door, and cracked it open just enough to see Margaret standing there, face twisted in pure fury. "Where is my CAR? She demanded, her voice trembling with rage. Daniel took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Impound lot, he said simply. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. You had no right to do that. Daniel tilted his head. Didn't we have this conversation already? Margaret huffed so hard it looked like she might blow over. You think you can just get away with this? You think I'm going to let this go? Daniel raised an eyebrow. You really don't have a choice. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red. This is harassment. Daniel let out a dry laugh. Margaret, you parked in my driveway 3 times after I explicitly told you not to. You ignored my notes. You ignored the police. You ignored the tow trucks. What exactly did you think was going to happen? Margaret jabbed a shaky finger toward his security camera. You're watching me. That's illegal. You can't spy on me. Daniel sighed. It's a security camera, Margaret. You know, to protect my property? If it happens to catch you breaking the law, that's not really my problem. Margaret's mouth flapped open like a fish. She was furious, but also clearly out of arguments. Then, suddenly, she did something unexpected. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her blouse, and adopted a calm, almost reasonable expression. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He knew what was coming. The guilt trip. Daniel, she said, her voice suddenly soft. I'm an old woman. Do you really want to make life harder for me? Daniel nearly laughed out loud. Unbelievable. You made life harder for yourself, he said, crossing his arms. Margaret sighed dramatically, as if she were the true victim here. You know, you're making enemies in this neighborhood. Daniel blinked. Oh, you mean the neighbors who told me they can't stand you? Margaret's entire body stiffened. She wasn't expecting that. She let out an offended gasp and spun around, storming back toward her house. You haven't heard the last of this, she shouted over her shoulder. Daniel shrugged. Sure, Margaret. And with that, she slammed her door so hard that her wind chime fell off the hook. For the first time since this whole fiasco started, Daniel felt confident it was finally over. Days passed. Then weeks. Margaret's car never showed up in his driveway again. But that didn't mean she had given up entirely. She refused to look at him. If he was outside, she would cross the street just to avoid passing him. If they ended up in the same grocery store aisle, she would turn around and leave like she had seen a ghost. It was honestly hilarious. Daniel's driveway, however, became somewhat famous. Neighbors, amused by the whole saga, started jokingly referring to it as the Margaret Zone. The irony, of course, was that Margaret was the only one who wasn't allowed to park there. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow next door, stopped Daniel while he was watering his plants. You know, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, I heard Margaret had to pay over $600 in towing fees. Daniel smirked. Good. Mrs. Patterson chuckled. She's been quieter than usual. I think she finally learned her lesson. Daniel glanced across the street. He could see Margaret peeking through her curtains, pretending she wasn't watching him. He gave her a polite wave. She immediately vanished. Yep. Lesson learned. Peace. For the first time in weeks, Daniel could come home after a long shift, pull into his own driveway, and not find a random car parked there. It was a simple thing, but after everything that had happened, it felt like winning the lottery. Margaret had finally backed down. Sort of. She still existed in the neighborhood, still lived directly across the street, and still made a point to pretend Daniel didn't exist. If he was outside, she would suddenly become very interested in her flower bed. If they happened to step out of their houses at the same time, she would immediately turn around and go back inside. It was comical, but Daniel wasn't complaining. He had won, and more importantly, his driveway was his again. That didn't mean the story ended quietly, though. Margaret's repeated towing incidents had turned into local legend. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Daniel before suddenly stopped him on the street just to chat. Hey, you're the guy who had Margaret towed, right? One man asked, giving him a thumbs up. Dude, I was hoping someone would put her in her place, another neighbor said. She once yelled at my wife for parking in front of our own house. Mrs. Patterson, who had lived on the street longer than anyone, was delighted by the whole thing. She's been a menace for years, she whispered conspiratorially one afternoon. It's about time someone put their foot down. Daniel didn't set out to be a neighborhood hero, but somehow he had become one. And then there was the nickname. Emily was the one who started it. One evening, she came home from work, grinning like a lunatic. You're not going to believe what Mark just called our driveway, she said, referring to the guy who lived 2 doors down. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Do I even want to know? Emily smirked. The Margaret zone. Daniel burst out laughing. It caught on. It started as an inside joke among their friends, but soon, even new neighbors were calling it that. You live near the Margaret zone, right? Someone asked one of Daniel's neighbors at a block party. The guy nodded solemnly. Yeah, you don't park in the Margaret zone. Ever. Even though Margaret was the only one not allowed to park there, the name stuck. Daniel embraced it. One day, for fun, he bought a small wooden sign and placed it near the entrance of the driveway. Welcome to the Margaret zone. Trespassers will be towed. He only left it up for a week, but it was enough for word to spread. Margaret saw it. Margaret was not amused. Emily swore that when Margaret spotted the sign, she turned so red that she looked like she was going to spontaneously combust. Daniel took it down eventually, mostly because he didn't want to push his luck. Margaret was already stewing in silent defeat, and he figured it was better to let things stay as they were. But that didn't mean he wasn't tempted to put it back up. Months passed. Margaret never parked in his driveway again. She didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge his existence, and seemed to pretend the entire incident had never happened. That was fine by Daniel. His driveway was his. His peace was restored. And Margaret? She had learned that if you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. Twice.